So, on the day that I make this, NCFCA Nationals is winding down, so it wouldn't surprise me if some of you wouldn't mind having a little bit of a break from debate before you get back to thinking about it. But I always found that some of my debaters, they wanted to go just do something else, but some others, right as the season was ending and right as Nationals was coming to a close, that was almost the moment when they were most excited to get started thinking about the next topic, just because they were coming off such a high over everything they'd accomplished. And there was a little bit of them that was so sick of the old topic that the idea of a new topic where everything wasn't set and fixed and they weren't stuck with an affirmative that they had mixed feelings about, that just felt really good to them. So I've been looking a little bit. I have kind of a preliminary survey of what I think is out there and a few bits of advice. If I were coaching full-time on the United Nations topic, this is probably the little bit of guidance I would give my debaters at our first meeting before we headed out to the library. Now, the first thing we would do, and I'm sure to mention this every year, is we would do a sweep of the library. We would, first of all, go to the best college library that we could reach, not just our own, but we would sweep several libraries. We would go to the books that were about whatever the topic was. So you would go to the books about the United Nations. We would get any books. We would probably go about 2005 or later. Most of those we wouldn't keep. We wouldn't do much with anything 2009 or earlier unless it looked really, really good. But we would stack them up, and especially if they were edited collections, we would copy them and take them with us. And of course, this is a long time ago when we did a lot more with photocopiers. There are more and more libraries now that actually have scanners where you can take your scan file and put it on a thumb drive, or you can even email it to yourself. I'm just a couple of blocks away from Knight Library at the University of Oregon, and they have a scanner there, and it's free. So you could potentially clean out the library if you could find a time of day when students weren't in there using the scanner. At any rate, we would begin with a sweep because it would be important that what we decided to do was driven by what was in the research, that we did not sit in a room and just dream up what we wanted our arguments to be about. Because when you're not driven by the research, you really wind up cobbling together arguments out of a bunch of not necessarily harmonized or consistent claims, whereas when you start off your debate season by doing a lot of reading and letting what the authors are talking about and where they make connections, you use those connections and you think in a very applied sense. What could I do with this? Is this the beginning of a potential disadvantage or of an affirmative or of a counterplan? But you make sure that they are the ones putting the claims together and they are backing it up with their knowledge of the particular subject matter. That's why it's so important to start with a sweep. With that said, there are some strategic realities that really don't change that much from year to year, so the short list of things to be looking for, to be digging around for articles for, this is my short list, what I would give to my debaters if we were going to get our team together to handle this topic. I would first of all want us to think about having a big stick affirmative. A big stick affirmative is good in one of two instances. If you know that you are the biggest, baddest, most organized, best think on your feet, most devastating team in your region, and really what you want is you want to carry around with you a big weapon that is going to intimidate and daunt most of your opponents, then you need a big stick affirmative. If you are right on the brink of greatness, and you made great strides in the past, but you kind of plateaued lately, then a big stick affirmative is often a good idea for you as well because it is going to make you work hard. And anytime you debate a team that's a little bit more experienced, a little bit more effective than you, you make such a big target that you give them lots of ways to put pressure on you, and responding to that pressure, you are very likely to become much better debaters. Now, what do I mean by big stick affirmative? Well, one of the nice things about this topic is they wrote what the big stick was into the topic wording. It would be to abolish the United Nations. A big stick affirmative is always something that is huge, decisive, simple, and straight up the middle of the topic. And we call it a big stick because you then take the biggest, baddest arguments, and by bad I mean good, the biggest, most heavy-duty arguments in favor of it, you line up several of them and you say, we have got a whole array of impacts that we expect to be winning by the end of the debate. You can run your offensive positions against us. We're probably going to outweigh them. We know our case inside and out. We've worked like dogs to research this thing and to be very, very deep on it, and you honestly just can't keep up with us on this. So I think what I would do, I would send my debaters out to try to find 4 or 5 very big impact arguments that the United Nations, if the United Nations went away, the world would be a safer place. So possibly you start off with human rights and incursions on sovereignty, and the big impact of human rights is the deontological impact that you can't tolerate any incursions on human rights. Then you get into the arms races and venting and peacekeeping operations and how all of those can ignite brushfire wars. Then you get into environmental protection, about how outside of the United Nations there would be a lot more interstate compacts, a lot more regional cooperation, but because so much is pushed off on the United Nations, where there's so much politicking going on and things move so slowly, the United Nations pretty much guarantees that the environment is going to get destroyed. And several more like that. Several big impact arguments that you could make that the United Nations actually makes things worse. If there was no United Nations, we'd be a lot better off. Now, I will say there's been an interesting discussion lately about topical counterplans, and if I were coaching a very experienced team and they were about to go debate a big stick, I think what we would do is we would, based on however much intelligence we had, old flows and so forth, we would try to write a counterplan where we had some sort of reform that fell short of abolishing the UN for each of these advantages. So maybe plank 1 of the counterplan would be to streamline the political negotiations over environmental agreements. And another plank would be for the United Nations to recognize individual nations' sovereignty, or at least to recognize the United States sovereignty in the area of human rights. So in other words, try to counterplan away each of these advantages, and then as disadvantages, take some of the agencies that are really effective, like the World Health Organization, like the IAEA, cut the cards that say that if they were spun off as independent agencies, they couldn't do what they do now. They couldn't be as effective because they need the support of the umbrella agency, and they need the legitimacy of being dependent on the General Assembly and the Security Council and so forth to do all of that. Then you counterplan, keep the United Nations in place, which is mutually exclusive with abolishing it. You reform several parts of the United Nations. That's topical, but it's mutually exclusive with abolishing it. And then your net benefits are that the good things about the United Nations, you solve all the affirmative advantages, and the good things about the United Nations, you're able to hold on to. So you might think about pursuing a big stick affirmative, and you might think about what are the odds that you're going to have a lot of counterplan debates, and especially a lot of topical counterplan debates, and it might still be a viable strategy for you. I was never that big of a fan of the big stick affirmatives because I always thought that in choosing an affirmative, we ought to use our heads and not run straight for the middle of the argumentative ground. I saw for myself that there were strategic advantages to doing so, but they always made me a little bit uneasy. There were certain debaters I had who just had the kind of personality where they were very feisty and very pugilistic and very bring it on. We don't want there to be any twists to our affirmative. We want it to be right out in the open what we do, and we are good enough at what we do that we can take you even though you know it's coming. So if that's you, then maybe a big stick affirmative. Some other possibilities. There's a fascinating looking book by an author by the name of Thomas G. Weiss, and the title of the book is What's Wrong with the United Nations and How to Fix It, and it's a 2012 book. And he is a professor of political science and international governance at CUNY, which is, I believe, CUNY. It's something University of New York, one of the SUNY, CUNY colleges in that system. He's the head of an organization of academics who study the United Nations, and it appears just from my skimming over the book that he makes a lot of systemic type arguments about the particular dysfunctions around the United Nations. And I think that probably if you check that book out, if you go to your local library, find out what you need to do to interlibrary loan and get your hands on a copy of that book, or maybe order it from Amazon, then I think you could quite possibly find half a dozen different clever affirmatives that do something worthwhile that falls short of being a big stick affirmative, but that you could get very familiar with and have a very solid, well-explained advocacy. So that's something I think you ought to check out. Then there are, I would say, five big areas that, from my skimming of what's out there, I think are going to be big all year long. And there are more than this, but these are the ones that I think are going to strike a chord with your judging pool. So I think these, I would predict, are the ones that will survive the sort of winnowing out that starts at the beginning of the season when people are not satisfied with their affirmative, so they switch. These are the ones that I would make sure, if I were marshaling my own team into the library, I'd make sure that we had started to think about our negative strategy, if nothing else. And I would want these to be on the list as candidates for affirmatives. And the first of these is epidemics. We have, for a generation, had more and more really, really good debate evidence written about pandemics, global pandemics, about how unprepared we are, about how when the next one strikes, which we're long overdue for, how devastating it's going to be, how much it's going to resemble the Spanish flu epidemic of 1917, how it could kill tens, hundreds of millions, possibly over 1 billion people. And the very best solvency mechanism, back in the day, the last time I researched this, the very best solvency mechanism that existed was simply international surveillance. Knowing where outbreaks were and keeping track of it so there wasn't a sudden eruption, a sudden spread that caught everybody by surprise. And the United Nations is right smack dab in the middle of that. So if you were to do some digging around in United Nations operations, and in particular the World Health Organization, in the World Health Organization and what they do for surveillance over the spread of potential pandemics, and you could find a way to make it more effective, to make it more resourced, to change, to get nations to accept reforms that would give the World Health Organization data collectors more freedom of action to get numbers on where particular diseases are breaking out. If you could find a good solvency mechanism to where you could claim improved surveillance of potential pandemics, I think you could get a sweet little affirmative out of that. The second area is sex trafficking. There's a lot said about it. There's a lot written about it. It is reasonably new as an issue with a high profile. I would say probably my sense of it is that it's been a high profile issue for less than 2 years. It's the kind of thing where the arguments are heart-wrenching enough that you can very easily, I think, get the judge on your side, that the judge will be rooting for you to have the right solution to this problem. And there's a good deal said about how this is a problem with a global reach and that there are United Nations operations that are tasked, law enforcement agencies and so forth, that are tasked to catching the people who run these networks, and that there are then education agencies that are, they have as their project to try to rescue people who are into trafficking and help them find their way back to a normal life. So I would do some digging into that if I were you. And it actually reminds me, the second to last year that I was a full-time coach in college debate, it's one of my sore spots after all these years. The topic was to increase security assistance to a list of nations in Southeast Asia. And I told them all the way back in July, when we were first tackling the topic, I said several of those nations are the world's hotspots when it comes to sex tourism and when it comes to the sexual victimization of children. And one of the things you could do with the security assistance topic, I knew this because we'd had one just a few years before, is you can do law enforcement cooperation. So I said, go find the solvency cards that the United States law enforcement could cooperate with the law enforcement agencies in those countries, and we could put a stop to sexual assault on children. And you will have the bulletproof affirmative. Well, they didn't want to debate that. They wanted to debate Blue Water Navy and deterring China. So off they went to the library. It's their debate career. I don't tell them what to do. I just give them advice. Guess what their new affirmative was for nationals? Yeah, they were so excited about it. There was a team from Fort Hays that had the same idea I had, and even though this team was not all that skillful, they had actually won some big debates because it really was that compelling an affirmative. So sometime around February, my debaters, suddenly it was a good idea to them, and they ran off to the library and they wrote themselves a sex trafficking, sex tourism affirmative, and actually did quite well with it at nationals. At any rate. A third area. This may seem kind of obvious, and I expect this to be in all of the source books, but making the IAEA more effective, making the inspections more effective, putting teeth in them, figuring out, is it sanctions, is it threat of action by the Security Council? What is it going to take for the IAEA to be effective to check the spread of weapons of mass destruction? I think if you can find a good advocacy for how to make the IAEA successful at what it does, and you can claim that you stop or slow the spread of nuclear weapons, then you could have a really tight, easy to explain affirmative that could resist a lot of offensive negative argumentation. I think it could just quite simply outweigh it. couple of other things that look like they're going to be very big. One of them is the International Court of Justice. There's a ton written about the International Court of Justice. First of all, that there are specific ways that it is dysfunctional, and there are specific reforms to its jurisdiction, to who can bring charges, to what the procedures are, and then there's a good deal written about how important it is that we are living in the era where a lot of world leaders are thinking it over. They're almost to the point of thinking they can do anything they want, that they can act with impunity, but there's been just enough successful prosecution of leaders of this kind, even if it comes decades later, that they are almost to the point of realizing that the international community will catch up with them. So I think that you have a reasonably good shot if you can figure out what package of solvency mechanisms you can explain well within the parameters of a debate. I think you could claim that you can put into place a system that will catch the perpetrators of genocide and ultimately call people to account and ultimately stop it from happening. And if you could get up in the last rebuttal and say, for 60, almost 70 years since the end of the Holocaust, we've said every year in commemorating it, never again. The reality is actually again and again. But because of what we propose to do and because of how good our solvency evidence is and how far ahead we are in the solvency debate, if you vote affirmative, you could finally be the one to say never again, and not just say it hopefully, but say it confidently and mean it. That's a 2AR I would love to give on my affirmative. One final thing I think I would check out if I were you would be the Security Council, because there's a lot written about how a lot of other things in the United Nations do not work because of the Security Council. Now this, I think, might get you into some of the fiat debates that people are so concerned about, because if you take away the power, the veto power of the Security Council members, it really does kind of strain credulity to believe that the members of the Security Council would go along with that. For you to just say, well, we fiat that they would. I think that you might actually get a little bit of static, and you might have some good productive debates about what is the limit of fiat. Can you, for the purpose of getting a debate started, can you assume that actors will act against their own interests? Can you do things that, frankly, do not pass the laugh test because they're that implausible? I mean, we're not talking anymore about Congress will never pass your plan. Yeah, well, we've got to get the debate started, so let's pretend they did. It's something more like, well, we fiat that Burma will become a model of human rights. Well, there's a point where it so strains credulity that it's not about starting the debate anymore. It's about avoiding the tough part of the debate. So almost anything, I think, that made a major change to the Security Council and took major power away from the members with the veto power, I think that argument is out there lurking, waiting for you. But I have also seen that there are some people who seem to be proposing that the Security Council just ought to have less direct oversight and a lot more things ought to be delegated out to other agencies, to where the veto didn't really, to where you kind of just sort of let the air out of the veto, you deflated it a little bit. So anyway, as you go off to the library and as you start sweeping the literature and seeing what it is that you ought to pursue, those are some things that would keep your eyes peeled for. And for any of you who are thinking, for goodness sake, I just got done with this season, can't I have a few days to go out and enjoy the summer before I come back and get to work on debate? The whole time I debated, I was always with you. Go have fun.